Shove it, man!
Shove It Squad, I'm back again with another original video concept. I swear to God I can't be stopped. The day I start rehashing the same video ideas is the same day you can all force me to get a Rob Terry and Wes Briscoe tattoo on my arm. So, have you ever wondered what wrestler has set the record for being in the most wrestling stables? Well, as I'm the king around here, I do have a pretty good idea what wrestler it is. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you good old Double J, Jeff Jarrett, and I'm about to crown him the king of wrestling factions.
Wait, hold your horses. Did I just hear you say king of factions? I swear, Marky, you really need to get the word king out of your vocabulary. I mean, recently, I hear you've been saying you're the king of these videos, and how on earth can you possibly make such bold claims when me, Top 10 Wrestling, is absolutely dominating you every week in the YouTube ratings war? If anyone is the king, it's me. And Jarrett as the king of factions? Don't make me laugh, Marky. Raven had way more factions, and I intend to prove it.
Oh, I see how it is. You again, is it? We're going to have a last man standing match here to see who's right about this. We're going to list the factions off in order of age, and it will be over once one wrestler cannot respond with a stable. To qualify as a stable, it must have 3 or more members and existed for more than a few weeks. It must have also played out in a proper wrestling company, so no indie stuff here. Ladies and gentlemen, in the blue corner this evening, representing Raven, currently residing in Manchester, but originally from the inbred capital of England, Skelmersdale, weighing in at 90.5 pounds, he is the defender of the week and the friend of the feral. Give it up for Top 10 Wrestling. And in the red corner this evening, representing Jeff Jarrett, from God's County, the founder of the Hawkamania movement and the leader of the Shove It Squad. He is the reigning and defending self-proclaimed king of YouTube. Shut up or I'll smack you one. Marky D, 1, 2, 3. So for all the hundreds watching at home, and the thousands in your mother's basement, and for Hawk Hogan plotting to take down AEW and all the generic YouTube wrestling channels around the internet, let's get ready to shove it! The Four Horsemen, WCW 1997. The Four Horsemen had a lot of different versions, and around 15 different wrestlers would be called a horseman during its run. Jarrett had left the WWF and flipped back to WCW for the 1000th time. Coming into WCW as the war was kicking off between them and the NWO, Jarrett had some decisions to make. Jarrett would eventually side with the Four Horsemen on the side of WCW, with Ric Flair backing him, although the rest of the group didn't really like him. Jarrett and Mongo were constantly fighting for Deborah's attention, and a few months later he was kicked out of the group by Flair due to causing the constant infighting. So basically it sucked and it was pointless, but it's still a faction. What you got, Tom?
The Cartel in GWF 1991. No, that was not a mistake. I said GWF and I meant GWF. GFW is something completely different and it stands for Global Fast Wrestling. What I'm talking about now is an actual wrestling company and not a pyramid scheme. This is GWF and it stands for Global Wrestling Federation, and it was broadcast on ESPN between 1991 and 1994 from Texas. The Cartel faction consisted of Raven, then wrestling as Scotty Anthony, Mick Foley, Rip Rogers and Mike Shaw, who would go on to be Bastion Booger. They were a heel faction in the company and they answered to the boss, a figure who wasn't revealed for a long time, and eventually it was revealed to be some random guy, and this was the end of the stable. Maybe I was the leader. What you got, Marky?
The NWA invasion of the WWF, 1998. Jarrett jumped back into the WWF and he was promised a feud with main eventer Stone Cold Steve Austin, so I'm not surprised he was excited. Unfortunately this didn't happen as Stone Cold saw Jarrett as beneath him, so it was back to the drawing board for good old Double J. Cornette randomly brought the National Wrestling Alliance to the WWF and Jarrett was awarded the NWA heavyweight title after beating Barry Windham. This faction had potential, but it was a case of bad timing, as 1998 was the height of the Attitude Era, and WWF were busy being as raunchy as they could possibly get away with on TV, whilst the NWA was completely old-fashioned in contrast. Jarrett only lasted a couple of months in the group, and it certainly wasn't as good as feuding with the Rattlesnake. What about you? What about Raisin?
The Diamond Mine, WCW 1992. Wrestling in WCW here as Scotty Flamingo, a rich surfer gimmick alongside DDP and Kevin Nash before they had also hit the big time. 3 future world champions, grown a bit. Anyway, where was I? Yeah, Raven wasn't exactly the focus of this group and he left WCW pretty quickly after falling out with the management there.
NWO 2000, WCW. The Chosen One was now back in WCW on a mission to win the World Heavyweight title. WCW attempted to bring the NWO back to life in a poor attempt to catch the WWF in the ratings. This time they rebranded the colours slightly so it was silver and black. Oh, that's going to make all the difference. It was Jarrett, Nash, Steiner, the Harris brothers, Bret Hart and Scott Hall. So it was a decent enough cast, but we'd seen it before. Jarrett did win the US title during this time, but nobody really looks back at it with much fondness. In fact, nobody looks back at Jeff Jarrett's time as a main eventer with much fondness. Not long after this, Bret Hart retired, and the NWO 2000 disbanded, with Vince Russo and Eric Bischoff coming back into WCW. There's plenty more where that came from, Tom. Be warned.
Raven's Nest, ECW 1995. Plenty more stables on this list for Raven as he forms Raven's Nest in 1995 ECW. This faction took many forms over the years, which will come up later in this list, but this was the original OG format. And there were so many members, I'm not going to list them all, but the main people you might remember are Stevie Richards, Cactus Jack, Balula, the Pitbulls, Blue Meanie and Nova. They were involved in some real edgy stuff at the time, including the Balula pregnancy storyline, brainwashing the Sandman's son, crucifying the Sandman, and constantly pushing the limit of what the TV censors would allow at the time. Most of the time was spent feuding with Tommy Dreamer and the Sandman, and he would also capture the ECW World title twice before heading off back to WCW. A successful faction here, let's see if Marky can top that.
The New Blood, WCW 2000. With Russo and Bischoff now back in WCW, they decided to reboot the product and strip all the champions of their belts. This led to a feud between the New Blood and the Millionaires Club. The New Blood faction consisted mostly of younger guys and WCW talents who'd not been given much of a push. On the flip side, the Millionaires Club consisted of the older veterans who didn't want to share the spotlight. The idea doesn't sound like a bad idea in principle, until you realise that the New Blood were supposed to be the bad guys. Why are they the bad guys? They just wanted a shot. Surely the veterans are the heels in this situation. Jarrett was one of the New Blood leaders alongside Bischoff and Russo, 3 guys that nobody particularly wanted to see on television. The storyline fell flat on its face and might have worked better if the heel-face dynamic had been switched. Jarrett was a 4-time WCW World Champion during this time, with lots of quick runs, but nobody cared. Back to you, Tom.
The Flock, WCW 1997. Now, similar to the earlier mentioned Nest, Raven was now in WCW and they decided to carry his grunge gimmick over as he forms the Flock in WCW, a group of social outcasts. No, not Heath Slater and the other 3. The group were often sat in the crowd watching the matches and looking miserable. They didn't have the best win-loss record, probably because most of the group were jobbers. Kidman and Saturn were probably 2 of the most successful members of the group, and Raven did win the US title and tag titles with Saturn during this run, which lasted over a year. They might not have been that successful, but it was one of the more memorable inclusions on this list.
The Magnificent 7, WCW 2001. Formed in the dying days of WCW, it was called the Magnificent 7 because there were 7 wrestlers, duh. Jarrett was not the focal point of this group, as Steiner was well into his roid rage gimmick at this time, and he was the proper main eventer of the group. Jarrett mostly feuded with the Rhodes family, until WCW was purchased by the WWF, and we all know what happened there. Jarrett was not hired, and if I speak about that much more, I risk having to visit a tattoo designer for the world's ugliest tattoos. So I won't, I'll shut up. You still alive, Tom?
The Deadpool, 1999 WCW. This faction truly was all the insane people just thrown into the group. You had Vampiro and the Insane Clown Posse and Raven. I bet there were some crazy stories to tell from the hotel rooms after the shows. Continued to run in WCW as the Dark Carnival, adding the Demon and, strangely,
Kings of Wrestling TNA 2004. The trio of Nash, Hall and Jarrett dressed in Elvis attires and sunglasses set about destroying the TNA roster. The highlight of this time was Scott Hall's most famous catchphrase of his career, "I'll be the one that looks like Elvis." They feuded with the Macho Man during his blink and you miss it stay in the company. Jarrett was the world champion at the time, but this caused friction with Hall and Nash after Nash kept trying to take the title from Jarrett, and Scott Hall took time away from TNA due to his outside problems. Anything else to comment on? Well, they used the same theme music as the Flying Elvises did earlier on in their TNA career. It was awesome. You must be getting low now, Tom.
The Alliance, 2001 WWE. After Vince McMahon bought out his WCW competition, a storyline started where some of the former WCW talents invaded WWE with Shane McMahon as their leader. Now, Raven was already in WWE prior to this happening and was one of the best parts of the hardcore division. During the invasion, the former ECW talent in the WWE joined up with the WCW talent to form the Alliance, a giant faction that warred with the WWE for a few months. Most people view this as one of the biggest missed opportunities in wrestling history, as hardly any of the WCW stars were bought in this storyline. And Raven was largely a background figure and wasn't exactly a key member of the stable. Yeah, I hold my hands up, this wasn't the best one on my list, but I'm going to throw everything at you until Raven wins.
Whatever, you goon. Planet Jarrett, TNA 2005. After the Kings of Wrestling, Jarrett wasn't alone for long. He was in the middle of his ginormous NWA World title reign, and he needed backup. This for me is one of the worst factions on this list, because it was literally all about Jeff Jarrett. I mean, look at the name of it. This faction also coincided with Monty Brown getting derailed, as he chose to join the faction and become a heel when he was at his hottest, rather than feuding with Jarrett for the belt. Jarrett ended up with the world title for around a year, whilst everybody else suffered. This faction did kickstart Alex Shelley and Paparazzi Productions, so it's got that going for it though.
The Gathering, TNA 2003. Here we go, we're on to the TNA stuff finally. This one is most famous because CM Punk was a member during his TNA run. Raven was the leader, and Punk, Mickie James, and Julio De Niro, who completed the Gathering, and it didn't last long before Punk and De Niro turned on Raven to side with Jeff Jarrett. Now, while Punk and De Niro would continue teaming as the Gathering even without Raven, it came to an abrupt end after Ring of Honor's owner who employed Punk was found out to be a nonce. Surely he must be running out soon, Marky. This is insane.
Immortal, TNA 2011. This faction made no sense. That's all I can say about it. In the lead up to the formation of this faction, Jeff Jarrett was getting bullied by Eric Bischoff and being forced to work in catering and scrub toilets to keep his job in TNA. After Bischoff and Hogan tricked Dixie into signing TNA over to them, Jarrett would be revealed to be one of the more prominent members of the group. But the problem is it didn't make sense because of everything Bischoff had done to him in the last few months. Jarrett was not the main eventer of the group because Jeff Hardy was there. Jarrett mostly feuded with Kurt Angle during this time, as they feuded over real-life issues with Jarrett marrying Kurt Angle's ex-wife. Jarrett was sent to work in AAA during this time, probably to try and distance him and Kurt Angle. The highlight of his time in Immortal was Jeff Jarrett beating up little kids in fake MMA matches. Talking of little kids getting beaten, here's Tom.
Serotonin TNA 2006. I hold my hands up right now. This is the worst faction on the list. But you know what? It's still a faction, and this video is about the king of factions, and it never said that factions have to be good, so who cares if this was bad. Raven was the leader of this faction, and the other members were Kazarian, Shawn Michaels' cousin Matt Bentley, and Johnny Devine, dressed as the Hamburglar. They were complete goofballs and lost all their matches, and after their matches, Raven would come out to join them, and they would all hit each other with kendo sticks. Raven said he didn't care about wins and only cared about inflicting psychological damage on his opponents. Well, that was probably a bad mindset to have because they literally lost 90% of their matches. Kaz seemingly didn't like being hit with a kendo stick every week, so he turned on them, eventually beating Raven at Hard Justice 2007 and ending this terrible group. Hey Marky, maybe Kaz can beat you in a match to end your terrible channel.
Oh, you'd like that, wouldn't you? Someone's got to be here to call you out every time you mess up, you know. RDX Rinka King 2012. TNA Wrestling ventured into India next. Check out my Rinka King video series I've been doing. I've been having some great fun with those videos. For the first 10 or so episodes, it's the world's most random faction, as Sonjay, Dutt, Magnus and Steiner are a team. What on earth do these men have in common? Well, they all have the same secret boss who eventually is revealed to be Jeff Jarrett. Abyss would also join up with the group, and some others as well. And guess what the faction would be doing? Well, it would be yet another power struggle storyline over Rinka King, a typical TNA storyline. Anyway, if you want to find out more, I'm not giving away too much here, as I make a video on the show every month. This show does feature an obese 8-year-old Indian wrestler, so that's worth tuning in for, I guess, if you're a fan of that sort of thing. Are you out for the count yet, Tom?
EV 2.0 TNA 2010. TNA was full of ex-ECW talents at this point, and it was eventually agreed to give these guys their own farewell pay-per-view that had been curing trouble on TNA. The pay-per-view Hardcore Justice 2010 took place. It was a bit sad really, but it also would have been a fitting chapter for all these old ECW guys to ride off into the sunset, but it's TNA, they didn't do that, and they all just stuck around in the company following the pay-per-view. The TNA roster was insanely bloated at this point, and I'm not talking about the ECW guys' stomachs. TNA were wasting way too much TV time focusing on these old guys at the expense of the originals. EV 2.0 feuded with Ric Flair's Fortune faction, even beating them on pay-per-view in a Lethal Lockdown match. Eric Bischoff wasn't a fan of the group, and Raven was forced to face Jeff Hardy with his job on the line, with Raven losing, and this was his last TNA appearance on TV. By this point, Raven was not his old self, and was a shell of his former self in terms of wrestling ability, and wow, I hold my hands up, I guess, I'm out. I've listed 9 factions and I thought that would be enough to win it. So, Jeff Jarrett has more? He has more factions? Wow. Jeff Jarrett truly is a god amongst men. But when it comes to factions,
Now that Tom's lost, I'm going to showboat a bit. I'm going to relax and give you another 2 factions, because I like to give everybody their money's worth. And at the end of the day, none of you came here to hear that idiot speak. You all came here to listen to the Hawk talk. Bullet Club 2014.
Bullet Club.
Some of you probably didn't remember this one. Jeff Jarrett had a brief time with the Bullet Club in 2014 in New Japan. Jeff was out from TNA and working on his new wrestling promotion GFW, and he was building relationships with New Japan. He cemented this agreement by hitting the New Japan wrestlers over the head with his guitar, broke 1,000 guitars and never drew a dime. He stuck around for a while with New Japan, but it felt like Jeff was just making an attempt to try and stay relevant. And finally, GFW 2015, Impact Wrestling. Jarrett had made some progress with his new wrestling company, Global Fast Wrestling. The point in it was to build relationships with other wrestling companies around the world, and to put on super shows. I've made an entire video on it recently, but when Jarrett came back into TNA in 2015, it was all just to promote his new brand on television. The exposure he was getting was in exchange for his remaining shares in Impact Wrestling. He also had his GFW wrestlers invade TNA, but the biggest star involved was Justin Gabriel, so it failed. It didn't last long, and it was clear that the wrestling brand was a failure, and they were sent packing, as GFW and Jarrett became involved in a pyramid scheme selling gold bars. Nowadays, Jarrett has made peace with the WWE, and he's been inducted into the Hall of Fame. Not sure if that's a faction though, but from my count, that's Jarrett on 11 factions. Surely that's the record for any wrestler. Of course, feel free to drop a comment down below if I'm wrong, but if you're gonna be like that, you'll make me say it, and you don't want to hear me say it. Shut up or I'll smack you one. Talking of people I'd like to smack, Tom, it was good having you on this video. Any chance I can take to make you look stupid is a good time for me.
Check out my channel Top 10 Wrestling, linked in the description. Trying to get to 200k subscribers, so any help would be appreciated. Thank you, Marky, for having me on your channel. I do love Hulk Hogan and Hulkamania, but nothing lasts forever. You will be hearing from me again really soon.